As the great poet T.S. Eliot once said, I gotta use words when I talk to you. The problem in the business world is that the words that we use often obfuscate the actual meaning that we're trying to convey. Or they get across what we're trying to say, and yet we don't realize when we use certain phrases and terms and coded language that our audience may have different associations with the language that we're using. Of course, I'm talking about corporate jargon. Everybody knows it, everybody's heard it, most of us use it, and almost everybody hates it. So we're going to talk today about corporate jargon, what certain terms pretend to mean and what we all know they secretly really mean, and really talk about speaking perhaps in a more modern way and speaking in benefits instead of just throwing a bunch of terms that honestly have just become cliches. To help me in this endeavor, I am joined by Jennifer King. She is a global corporate coach specializing in communications and performance, as well as an actor and theater director and a whole bunch of other things besides. Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for joining me today.
Hello, Derek. Very nice to be here.
Thank you for coming on, and thank you everybody out there for listening to this episode of Digital Signage Done Right. Don't forget you can subscribe to the podcast, and if you want to follow along, there is a transcript on the Physics website. Just go to physics.com/resources/podcast, and there it is. Whether you're using digital signage or not, our podcast gives you practical tips for communications and content to better engage your audience. I'm Derek DeWitt. Welcome to Digital Signage Done Right. So, Jennifer, it's funny, doing a Google search for corporate jargon, you get a lot of articles that are quite negative about the term. Why is that? What do you think is going on with that? Because everybody uses it.
Yes, and I will tell you, early on in my career in coaching, I was working with a firm that literally gave me a jargon vocabulary list in order to learn to communicate with the corporate world. And I think what we often miss is, well, what we want is to connect. So we want to learn a language that everybody has so that we can feel a sense of belonging and that we're somewhat special because we know the lingo. But at the same time, what is happening is we're really missing what is the purpose of why we are communicating. And that is to connect, to inspire, to do many things. But unless you're really aware of that and just throwing out jargon in order to sort of get by, you're really not having any meaningful impact.
Jargon in many ways is a shortcut. Like I think of, the mechanical world, the world of engineering, a world of science, more specialized things like theater, which like there are just certain phrases and terms that you use that are just, we all know what they mean. They're dense with meaning. And so it's kind of a shortcut. So on the surface, jargon is useful because it is efficient in many ways. And yet, when it gets overused to the extent that it certainly has in the corporate world, I think, it almost gets stripped of its meaning. It becomes this bizarre, free-floating cliche.
It gets stripped of its meaning, or we elevate meaning of some things that we really don't want out there anymore. Some terms have been reborn and reused in the corporate world that can be offensive, can be violent, or in some cultures have no meaning at all. So it all goes back to, what are you trying to do? What are you really trying to do? And is your language serving you? Or are you doing that thing where you're just trying to get by? The terms we always use is bandwidth. Do you have so little bandwidth that you've lost the art of communication? And so a way to circumvent that is, I know a lot of jargon, everybody gets it, and we can move really quickly. But in that moving very quickly, there is something lost.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea behind like the slow food movement and the slow cities movement and all these other things that are just like, hey, as Simon and Garfunkel said, slow down. You move too fast.
Exactly.
Take it easy. Just, yes, when you need to be fast, be fast. And, if your business model is move fast and break things, go ahead and do that. But it doesn't have to be 24/7, Take a moment, judge each interaction on its own merits instead of treating every interaction as the same interaction.
And And don't get me wrong, as you mentioned, there are places where it absolutely makes sense. When you have a group that you've been working with, a team you have where you're speaking your common language, but that is one particular audience that you're with. Have you identified your needs for the same audience? And is that language going to communicate what you're hoping to convey to another audience, which may have been fine with your own team?
And it's also funny, there's this other component to the use of jargon in various occupations, which is to sort of bind the group together, because we all know what it means, and also a little bit to keep out the outsiders. I'm reminded a little bit of Cockney rhyming slang in East London, where it was opaque to outsiders. They just have no idea what you're talking about.
That's absolutely correct. Quite the contrast, Derek, is a few years ago, I directed a play called Dry Powder, which was all about private equity. And when I received the script, I didn't know what anything meant because everything is finance jargon. It becomes its own language, its own Shakespearean text, so to speak. But literally, I could go to a finance person and say, could you please tell me what all this means? And they could rattle it off like no one's business. But I put it in front of actors, and we literally had to spend 4 days around a table dissecting the script just to understand what the meaning was of all that jargon.
Right. It's funny. It's become almost Elizabethan.
Yeah, yes. So just imagine that. Now, this was very intentional on the writer's part. She's making comment on that particular world that many cannot reach. Well, put that in everyday context. How often are you doing that in your own world? And also, how are you using jargon that might be hurting others? You talked about, the importance of creating belonging, but what are you doing to keep people out?
Whether it's intentional or I think oftentimes unintentional.
I often like to give people the benefit of the doubt. That's what I really try to do, and it is unintentional. But that's why it's so important to examine the words you are using rather than just taking for granted that what you are saying is going to meet the needs of your listener, or is going to create connection with your listener, or is going to create trust. And bottom line, that's what you want to do. But if you're saying things like tribe, or open the kimono, is that really serving you? One of the things that in the Bay Area, you hear it very often is, ooh, they drank the Kool-Aid. And we take that for granted that that's something we can use if, we've adopted whatever they're saying is just being the wisdom of us moving forward. And I remember being in a meeting and someone said, oh, I drank the Kool-Aid. And it got a very strong reaction from someone who had lived during the time in the Bay Area when Jim Jones and the People's Temple had drank all the Kool-Aid, and hundreds had died. And so that was injuring that person, and dare I say, creating trauma in an already traumatized world. Post-pandemic, it's an interesting landscape. And even more so, I think we need to pay attention to how we communicate with one another and the words and phrases we are choosing to use. Are they benefiting my listener? Are they actually communicating the message I intend? Those are the things to consider rather than just allowing the mouth to rattle off.
Here's a question. Do you think that jargon is used more by like managers and C-suite types, or does it pervade all levels of many organizations?
I would say that it's individual specific with who I've worked with, but I think that generally people try to adapt and fit in and relate. And so if you've got a team that is, primarily using jargon, chances are the others around them, including managers and leaders, are going to do the same thing.
Like I'm a writer, and I also have done theater and other performance-oriented things. And, in my world, finding a particularly unique way to phrase something is what is held in high esteem. And yet it seems in the worlds of jargon, it's quite the opposite. It's these standardized plug-and-play phrases that seems to be admirable.
I think plug and play is apropos. But again, I think we're all trying to remodulate ourselves as we're trying to figure out the way that we're moving through the world. Because for a while it was quick, 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 quick. And then the pandemic allowed this time of great space And I think that for many of us, we're just trying to figure out how to, I say us, I think for many, we're just trying to figure out how to fit in, how to be effective, and how to control what we can. And sometimes that means adopting other practices. It means adopting other language. But are you being, and this word I can say can become a little jargony, but authentic? Are you really speaking to who you are? Are you really reflecting your values, what you believe, what you stand for? And that's where I think jargon gets in the way because it just makes everything gray and we don't see the individual.
That's for sure. It's interesting. I came across an article on LinkedIn, Pulse, written by Bob Lovely, an executive coach, and he said he thinks there are 4 motivations for people in business using jargon. And he says they're all self-serving. He says first one is to fit in, to sound like you belong. The second one is to feel important, to impress themselves and to impress others. Third might be to express a deeper hidden meaning, using it as that sort of condensed shortcut. And then the fourth one, he says, is just self-preservation, which I thought was interesting. Like, I guess it's if I don't use this terminology and everybody else around me is, then they're gonna get me.
And what I notice is that such the focus on oneself. And I think that's what can be really missing in great leadership is how are you in service of the moment? How are you in service of your team? How are you in service of the company? And that needs to extend beyond you. What are their needs? And how are the words that you are using meeting their needs? And can you expand your meaning to elevate the conversation?
All right, so I've collected from a couple of great articles out there, and we'll have links to them in the transcript on the Visix website for people who are interested. Some of them with some truly great titles. One of them was called All the Soul-Sucking Corporate Phrases Everybody Loathes Interpreted, which is in Los Angeles Magazine. So I'm going to throw some of this jargon at you, and then we'll just see what you have to say about it. One of the first ones I came across was the word leverage, which one article said is probably the most used corporate jargon term there is.
Well, what it does is it takes humanity out of the equation because it is a money term. And so, yeah, we want to leverage, but what are we really talking about? We're talking about human beings. It may not be the intent, but are you aware of what you are saying when you're saying and how that might impact the listener? I'm going to leverage you on this one. We're going to leverage, this team over there to play to their strengths. Well, those team are people.
Yeah, I always think this about the term human resources. I've always objected to this term human. It used to be called personnel, which at least has the word person in it. And then we switched it to human resources at some point in the past. And I was like, human resources? Next, why don't we just call us, I don't know, assets?
And again, if you notice that it's dehumanizing.
That's why I wonder sometimes if it doesn't come a lot of times from the top down, because it almost seems to me like perhaps it is dehumanizing and distancing to sort of make the people, this whole group of individual people. If I'm a mid-level manager, I may have hundreds of people under me and under the people I manage. And I need them all to do the same things, basically. And so I find a way to kind of standardize them so that I can get them to accomplish the goals that I set for them.
Well, it comes down to efficiency. And it also comes down to, as you said, we've got all of these people. And if you're trying to work in an efficient manner by not giving them a face, but allowing them to sort of be the mechanics of a machine, then perhaps you're thinking, I can be as efficient as possible, which by then, okay, use the jargon, do what is the quickest. But if you really want to build relationships and allow people to prosper, taking shortcuts, not putting your team first is going to lead you down to a path which may take longer to happen, but what will happen where you just aren't going to see strong performance because people will no longer be seen.
Yeah, this is true. All right, here's another term, bandwidth. So, for example, if the boss says, hey, team, I need you to do this, and the leader of that team says, we just don't have the bandwidth. What they're saying is, well, we don't really have the time or the staff, the personnel to do this. But what they're really saying is, we're not going to do any more work on that unless we're compensated.
Absolutely. And I enjoy the genesis of these words, or what words, or what the culture of where these words come from. So you think of leverage, I think of the finance industry. I look at bandwidth and I think of tech and how much we've adopted from those industries. And I think you're exactly right. Is bandwidth is a really great way of really not saying what you really mean. What are you really saying? Are you at an exhausted level where you can't take on anymore? That's something that really needs to be communicated. Or are you feeling as though you're not being compensated enough? What is the conversation that really needs to happen, and why are you hiding that?
All right, here's another one. We need to make this an action item, which means we need to assign somebody this task. But isn't there sort of another thing in there of, and the person we assign this to is the person who we're going to throw under the bus if it all fails?
Well, action item can be a call to action. As you said, it can also be weaponized. So again, the action items, we're going to have this person take on this task. And I think it really depends on what is the intent behind that particular word. It can be something to motivate, but it also can be something to hurt. And what is really your intention underneath it? And I think that that will read if you have an awareness of what you are trying to do. So again, there are ways that we are going to speak. Certainly anyone could take our discussion to task and say, I heard a lot of jargon and coded messaging under all of that. But what is the intent underneath what you are saying?
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing that the intent is coming once again to the forefront of even internal communications, when we're messaging through digital signage or emails or however else, Slack teams, however else we're communicating with employees, and even just, verbally in the office or in meetings and so on and so forth, that once again, intent seems to be becoming more and more important. And I can't help but wonder if this isn't a little bit to do with the Zoomers, the Gen Zers, who seem to have reprioritized things. They're very much rejecting a lot of things that were so commonplace in the 20th century that, people of our generation just kind of went, oh, well, I guess we either join in, or we just give up, because that's the system. There's no way to change it, and they're coming in and saying, actually, that's ridiculous. Like you said, we're people. Of course, we can change it.
Are you saying they're disrupting, Derek?
It's so disruptive. This is going to disrupt the industry, which is a violent phrase. Disrupt.
Well, and think of how many times we use violent language. We crushed it. There's going to be collateral damage. There's, the bleeding edge. Those are things that are incredibly violent. And do we really need that language in our vernacular?
I've often thought that the business world uses a strangely large amount of militarized vocabulary.
Well, we look at the title of the play I mentioned early on, Dry Powder. I mean, it has to do with guns.
Oh, of course it does. It didn't even occur to me. Oh, yeah.
But it's about capital. I mean, really, what there is it's a slang for capital. So it's something we've always done is we weaponize our language, and we've done it for hundreds. Thousands of, can I say thousands? Possibly. But I even, because of my background, can look at Shakespeare, and part of the art of what he did was weaponizing language. It's what we do in order to create power.
Do you think, reality TV shows have become really just a huge sector in the filmed entertainment world? I watch some. I think everybody in America watches at least one or two. And it's funny because, again, we see these cliche phrases again and again and again. One of them constantly, he threw me under the bus. And I'm like, first off, that is a horrible visual. And second off, is it really that serious? Like, did they throw you under the bus? Or are you just trying to express dissatisfaction with something? Because those are two very different things. The first one is accusing someone of purposely sabotaging your chances at something in order to gain favor or to knock you down. And I don't know that that's always used correctly.
It's interesting that you say that. Oftentimes, I'm wondering what is underneath, what is the hidden meaning of what they are saying? And if you think about the reality shows, it's all about sort of building a brand or sort of being seen in a particular light. And what the jargon does is it allows there to be distancing. So if you're putting that out there, they threw me under the bus. Well, what does that really mean? And there's no getting underneath that unless you really go deep. And I'm not sure if we're really seeing that in reality television. So, of course, it could be the perfect place for this kind of jargon because it allows there to be a distancing.
Sure. Especially when, you're starving on an island with a bunch of strangers, you're like, I can't think. I've had, 200 calories a day for 2 weeks.
And also, if you can't think and that's what comes to mind, that is real for you.
Yeah, it feels that way. I watch Survivor, and there's a lot of language on there that is, I mean, really, I'm terrified. I'm fighting. I'm literally fighting for my life. I'm like, but you're not. You're not literally fighting for your life. If you die, I'm pretty sure Survivor's days are numbered.
Think about the world that they're in, Derek, that this are their given circumstances. And you can't help but wonder, don't know this, if there's some sort of scripting that they're given to allow that language to create its own culture, which is Survivor, and so throw under the bus, I'm going to die. All of those things help to create the suspense that allows audiences to come back and watch.
For sure.
Creating that drama through language.
Yeah, that's for sure. And it is very dramatic. Another one that you often hear is we got to trim the fat, which of course comes from the world of butchery.
Yes.
Trim the fat that we don't want off the meat. And then over time, this has, I think a lot of people don't know this, is where it actually comes from. And so when you say we need to trim the fat, meaning we're going to fire a bunch of people. So then it's like, so what did you just call me? Did you just call me fat?
And as you said, that the way that we're identifying language as dehumanizing, which I think this time has been remarkable in the fact of body positivity. And that movement is powerful. You use a term like that, you're only promoting language that goes against body positivity, number one. And number two, it identifies people as something that are unhealthy, unneeded, gross, need to be cut off.
And discarded, fed to the cats.
And that's one of the things to note is how easy it can be to make really hard decisions if you can disconnect from human toll. All of these things are meant to distance ourselves from what we're really doing. If you don't have a human face, Derek, and I have to get rid of you, I'm not going to feel that pain because you don't mean anything to me. You're the fat. It needs to go.
Right. Yeah, that's for sure. So speaking of cats, and it's actually a phrase that I personally quite like, but I've overheard it so much now that I'm beginning to not like it, which is, boy, trying to get everybody to work together on this project has been like herding cats.
It's so reductive. And it's easy and it's funny. So again, if you think about these terms, they do a couple of things. Number one, yes, they can dehumanize, but also they can bring some levity to a stressful situation. But again, it goes back to what is your intention behind saying it? Is it to get a laugh? Is it to express frustration? But bottom line, as a result, you might be demeaning other individuals in the process.
Well, and it kind of also, something I read about that particular phrase also said it kind of hints at a lack of accountability and leadership. You're putting all the blame on the workers, who are these cats, and you're just the poor person who's been tasked with hurting them. But you're their manager, you're the leader. So do a better job.
Well, absolutely. And you think about how we were talking earlier about the sense of it being focused on oneself. So if you're able to put down the other, that's only elevating who you are.
So now I've got two phrases. Let's circle back on this and let's take this offline. And both of them kind of mean, hey, look, I don't want to talk about this right now, or I can't talk about this right now. But this article I read said both of these phrases are actually super passive aggressive. How so?
Well, I think they can be passive aggressive. Let's circle back on this right now can mean that you don't want to talk about it, or that, you're not ready to talk about it. And sometimes you aren't ready to discuss something. Sometimes you do need to take a pause and collect more data, or things could be getting heated. And how do you circumvent that? Do you want to call it out and say, hey, this seems like this isn't a good time for us to talk about this right now. So let's circle back later. Again, I think it comes back to, are you using it for a specific purpose, or are you just throwing it out there in order to manage a situation? But are you aware of what you're managing?
That's interesting.
And are you communicating that?
All right, I got a couple more for you. This initiative needs to be mission critical.
Oh, there we go again. First of all, it is being blown out of proportion by such a standard by allowing it to be mission critical, because suddenly I feel like we're waiting for a rocket to take off.
Yeah, right, exactly. Or I think it's also used in like the military as well.
Absolutely. And this also speaks to the sense of allowing the stakes to become very high. And so if the stakes are that high, there's this element of stress or danger, and we need to protect ourselves, which calls to question, do we want to feel that defended in the workplace?
Because a lot of this is so, sort of energizing, if it isn't this attempt to get this kind of like, this is important, but this is also important, but this is also very important, but this is important. And you really need to be, look, I mean, here's the thing, guys, the low grade coffee you're supplying is just not going to cut it if you expect me to come into this office and work at top speed, top performance, top energy levels for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. It's just not going to cut it. I'm going to need better coffee at the very least. Like, nobody can run like that. Sprinters only run for a short distance.
The other thing to consider, Derek, is how much are you using jargon? So there can be times where you use mission control to help to make a point, but you've already set yourself up, and it's just that tagline you're using that everybody can hook onto. I keep talking about intentionality, but again, sometimes jargon, if you're specific and you know why you're using it, can be helpful in conversations or in presentations. And for instance, this is mission critical. If you haven't used jargon the entire time and mission critical isn't really in your vocabulary, then your team might sit up and listen for a moment. So again, it depends on how are you using language strategically to meet the needs of the moment.
We sort of evolved to look for novelty, because novelty is, oh, what's that? Is it something I can eat? Is it something that's going to eat me? This is where we are. I came across, looking at a bunch of different lists of corporate jargon, I came across one I'd never heard before. Maybe you have. Here's the saying: don't boil the ocean on this. We don't need to be too detailed, which seems to be saying you're being pedantic and you're wasting a lot of time. Boil the ocean. I've never heard this.
Which is another term for jargon, which, let's not get into the weeds.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah.
It's just something that to replace what is really being meant. Don't get too much into the details. There's other priorities that we want to focus on. However, sometimes we do need to have a visual. There are certain individuals which are visual learners, and they're actually going to grab on to boil the ocean or into the weeds, and that's going to make meaning for them. So as much as jargon, we were talking about the pitfalls of jargon, again, what I'm leaning into a little bit is when it can be helpful.
Well, I know we've talked in the past. So one of the things that you're focusing on in communications coaching is this idea of try to speak in benefits.
Yes.
Instead of, because a lot of this jargon is, like you said, it's military, it's sports, it's war, it's sometimes a bit sexist. Like you said, open the kimono. Good Lord. That's a lot to unpack in that one, It is this kind of like, because it's business world for so long was such a boys club, and this kind of a thing. It's just, well, I'm just talking. But there are these sort of, this cultural baggage that comes along with a lot of this. And if you're going to use the jargon for its succinctness, to be more effective, don't use it so often, and instead, as you like to say, recast things in this terms of speaking in benefits. How does one go about doing that?
I think you have to know your audience first and foremost. Who are you speaking to? What is your intent? And at the end of the meeting, what do you want them to do? That is where you have to spend some time researching, preparing in order to create the strongest value for those moments for your audience, whether it's your team, whether it's one person, whether it's 1,000. If you can critically think about what the needs are of your audience and how language can be used to serve those needs, that's when it becomes beneficial. However, so often leaders become unaware of how or why they're using language, and they fall into pitfalls of the jargon, which then becomes reductive and has no meaning. And it's not just leaders, it's across companies, it's across industries.
Oh, it's politicians. Good Lord. I mean, we see it. We see it constantly. You're just like, huh? That was fascinating. One of my favorite lines in the movie All the President's Men is the White House says about some of the early Washington Post articles on Watergate is Bradley says, well, that's a non-denial denial. They call us liars. We start circling the wagons. And then I went, ooh, he said circling the wagons. That phrase hasn't aged well.
The good news is we're evolving. The thing that becomes challenging is that it requires more time to consider what you are going to say and why. However, if you take the time, you're going to create empathy. You're going to build stronger relationships. And as I mentioned, you're going to cultivate trust. But if you don't take that time, chances are you may alienate someone or an entire group because you are not aware of the language that you are using, the power of that language, and how it isn't doing what you're hoping it will achieve, and that is to create a sense of belonging. You're actually creating a space where people feel disenfranchised, feel devalued, and as a result, may not want to stay. And now more than ever, the need to retain people is critical. And that's why communication becomes crucial, and your awareness of how you are using language. And are you taking the time to consider others and the impact you are making with your words?
So those are some thoughts on how we can maybe be a bit more thoughtful and a bit more, let me say, mindful in the language that we use, especially when we're trying to achieve a particular goal by communicating with somebody. I'd like to thank Jennifer King for talking to me today and giving really 110% and helping us take it up to the next level when it comes to language.
It was wonderful to unpack jargon with you today, Derek.
I think we got a lot of good learnings out of this.
It was a slam dunk.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. If people are interested in getting more advice on how to navigate the 2020s and beyond as the corporate culture continues to shift and change, how can they get in touch with you?
Please visit me at jenniferkingcoaching.com.
Easy to remember. And of course, there'll be a link in the transcript as well. Again, thank you, Jennifer, for talking to me. And thank you, everybody out there, for listening. For more free stuff, head to resources on physics.com for guides, videos, and more to help with your visual communications. Please subscribe and share, and contact us for information about our digital signage solutions.